We had to continue the massacre. It was kill or be killed. Sergeant Polzak, Regiment of Zouaves.
Finally, the British brought up their own artillery, which together with the French assault proved decisive. The Russians retreated. The following day, Captain Clifford, who painted these watercolours, came across one of the Russians he had wounded during the battle.
This morning, as I passed the Russians, prisoners and wounded, a man amongst them ran up and called out to me and pointed to his shoulder bound up. It was the poor fellow whose arm I had cut off yesterday. He laughed and said, "Bono Johnny." I took his hand and shook it heartily, and the tears came in my eyes. I had not a shilling in my pocket. Had I had a bag of gold, he should have had it. Our loss has been a sad one, and we are but ill able to stand such victories. Adieu, Henry.
The Allies' victory at Inkerman had taken them no nearer Sebastopol, but had inflicted horrendous casualties on both sides, for which the medical staff and facilities were to prove utterly inadequate. Already thousands had died of disease and on the battlefield, and yet the British had very little in the way of organised medicine for the growing numbers of sick and wounded. The French army had uniformed vivandières, at least one to each regiment. The vivandières looked after the rations and repaired the men's clothes, as well as tending the sick and wounded. The British had no equivalent. Each regiment had been allowed to bring out 6 wives per 100 married men, but such women were neither uniformed, trained, nor paid. Some managed to eke out a living doing laundry, but many ended up needing nursing themselves. Fanny Jubilee, the 24-year-old wife of a well-to-do cavalry officer, was shocked at the British situation.
We have no ambulance wagons. They are nearly all broken down, or the mules are dead, or the drivers are dead or dead drunk, as well one as the other as far as usefulness goes.
But one woman in London who had been following the war in the press was determined to do something to help. Florence Nightingale was the 34-year-old manager of a women's hospital in Harley Street, London. She wrote to the government proposing a private expedition to Scutari. She was quickly appointed superintendent of the female nursing establishment of the military hospitals in Turkey, and 38 nurses were selected to accompany her to the barracks hospital. The British medical authorities had given the hospital a clean bill of health. Nightingale was unconvinced.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 25th of November. When we came here, there was neither basin, towel, nor soap in the wards, nor any means of personal cleanliness for the wounded, except the following. 30 were to be bathed every night, but this does not do more than include a washing once in 80 days for 2,300 men. The consequences of all this are fever, cholera, gangrene, lice, bugs, fleas, from the using of one sponge in many wounds.
With the funds at her disposal, she bought soap and basins and organised the complete cleaning of the hospital. Every day she paced the miles of corridors, then returned to her room writing letters full of new requests to the authorities at home.
January the 8th, 1855. The fact is that I am now clothing the British Army. The sick were re-embarked at Balaclava for these hospitals without recovering their kits, also half naked besides. And when discharged from here, they carry off, small blame to them, even my knives and forks, shirts, of course, and hospital clothing also. In all our corridors, I think we have not an average of 3 limbs per man. We have 4 miles of beds, and not 18 inches apart. Yet in the midst of this appalling horror, we are steeped up to our necks in blood. There is good. As I went my night rounds among the newly wounded, there was not one murmur, not one groan. The strictest discipline, the most absolute silence and quiet prevailed.
The myth of Florence Nightingale is this rather serene woman floating down the corridors at night holding the lamp and gazing tenderly at the wounded, which is very far from the real Florence Nightingale. She did, in fact, walk around the barracks every night in order to see that the soldiers were being well cared for, to see if there were any who wanted to talk, to write letters home. She took a very close interest in them, but she wasn't this ethereal figure. She was a very practical woman. She liked to do some nursing, but that she knew that that was not what her great skill was. She was able to cajole and threaten the orderlies so they kept the place clean in a way it never had been before. She was able to persuade the doctors that they had thought of the changes themselves. She was above all a brilliant administrator.
As cleaning became the nurse's main duty, Welsh nurse Elizabeth Davis was one of several who felt they could be more useful in a strictly medical role nearer the front. Against Florence's wishes, she left Scutari and went to Balaclava.
One soldier there had been wounded at Alma by a shot which passed through his left breast above the heart and came out below the shoulder blade. His wound had not been dressed for 5 weeks, and I took at least a quart of maggots from it. From many other patients, I removed them in handfuls. When the wounds were regularly attended to, these men soon got well. I do not believe that maggots ever occur in cases where the wounds are properly cleansed and dressed. I always consider their presence as proof of neglect.
Interestingly enough, at the same time as Florence Nightingale was collecting her nurses in London, in Russia there was a realization that nothing was being done for the wounded in Sebastopol. So one of the Grand Duchesses set up a group known as the Sisters of Mercy, who were taken to Sebastopol to nurse the wounded there. They arrived after Florence Nightingale had arrived, but they were able to have a more immediate effect probably than Florence Nightingale did, because they were on the spot. They actually went down and looked after the wounded on the battlefield.
Russia's top surgeon, Nikolai Pirogov, was invited to take charge. Like Nightingale, Pirogov was convinced that administration, not medicine, plays the major role in helping the sick and wounded.
I spend from 8 in the morning until 6 at night in the hospital, where the blood flows in rivers. Arriving in Sebastopol 18 days after Inkerman, I found over 2,000 wounded, all lumped together lying on dirty mattresses, soaked with blood. Who do they take these soldiers for? Who will fight well when he is convinced that the wounded will be thrown down like dogs?
Surgical operations were performed simultaneously on 3 operating tables. Pirogov could complete an amputation in 7 minutes, undertaking or supervising some 5,000 operations in 10 months. Russian nurse Yekaterina Bakunina served with Birokov in the Nobles' Assembly, working long hours in the operating rooms. In one letter she describes a typical night.
Everything in the grand hall was ready. Glasses, vodka, the samovar was boiling. At 11 p.m. we heard the sounds of firing, and immediately the main ceremonial doors were thrown open, and then the words would ring out. This one to Nikolaevsky battery. That meant he was slightly wounded. This one to remain here. That meant there would be an amputation. This one to the Gushin house. That meant there was no hope.
But bullets, bayonets and shells were not the main killers of the war. Having successfully fought off 2 attempts to force them back into the sea, the British felt secure in the natural harbour of Balaclava. But they had reckoned without the weather. On November the 14th, 1854, Fanny Jubilee was on board ship in Balaclava harbour when a hurricane struck.
Ships were crushing and crowding together, all adrift, all breaking and grinding each other to pieces. By 10 o'clock we heard the most frightful wrack was going on amongst the ships at anchor, and some of the party started for the rocks. The next tidings were that the Prince, the Resolute and the Rip Van Winkle, the Wanderer, the Progress and a foreign bark had all gone down, and out of the whole, not a dozen people saved.
21 British ships and 14 French ships went down in the storm. Most of the army's warm clothing and medical supplies were lost, just as winter began. Supplies which weren't sunk in the storm were left rotting in Balaclava harbour, as a combination of impassably muddy roads and chronic inefficiency prevented their delivery to the front. 2 days later, Lieutenant Llewellyn made another note in his journal.
November the 17th. I rode to Balaclava today through a sea of mud in which the British Army waded to and fro, on foot or ponyback, driving arabas, oxen, mules, dromedaries, engaged in the hopeless task of getting daily food to camp. Here a commissariat wagon had overturned in the mud the day's rations of a regiment. There, a huge gun lay on its side and blocked the way. All the way down, the track was haunted by a string of mules bearing the daily quota of sick men to Scutari, and marked by the bodies of the animals that have died in harness.
As the weather worsened and autumn turned into winter, the British Army found itself bogged down in bureaucracy.
The commissariat, which was in charge of providing food and equipment and clothing for the soldiers, was a branch of the Treasury, so that it was always trying to save money. And they had also taken on, as employees, hidebound officials who had no flexibility at all and would allow nothing to be handed out unless they had received forms, often in duplicate, perhaps triplicate. And so it was really curtailed by a series of rules and regulations, which unfortunately the people running it were too unimaginative to think they could break.
With animal fodder among the supplies left to rot in Balaclava harbour, the starving horses were reduced to eating each other's tails. For the men without adequate rations or warm clothing, trench duty was a nightmare in the long hours of sniper fire and occasional shelling.
December the 6th. Today we count 160 dead out of the 600 men of our regiment who landed a month since. The men have been 5 nights out of 7 in the trenches. All the regiment, not incapacitated by sickness, went into the trenches last night. Returning this morning, they were at once, and without breakfast, sent down to Balaclava on fatigue to carry up bags of biscuits on their backs, whence they are now returning just in time to go into the trenches again tonight. Our men are being worked and starved to death. Their feeble stomachs reject the ration of greasy pork, and we have never got the sugar, rice, or vegetables to which we are entitled. Take with this that the men are usually wet through, that their clothes are torn to pieces, and their wretched government boots soleless, and we have sufficient reason for the death rate. Lieutenant Richard Llewellyn.
Many soldiers simply froze to death in their trenches and were only discovered by the next shift. Others were bayoneted where they had fallen asleep from exhaustion while on duty. Indeed, the Russians believed that winter was their strongest ally. As naval officer Piotr Leslie put it,
"We've got a real Russian winter. There has been such a big snowfall that it comes above the knee, and to add to it there are frosts at night. There hasn't been such a winter in Sebastopol for a long time. We don't know how to thank God for such weather. It is very unpleasant for our enemy. Of those who have surrendered to us, there hasn't been one whose hands or feet haven't been frostbitten."
At Balaclava Hospital, Welsh nurse Elizabeth Davis described the first cases of frostbite she saw in the Crimea.
The toes of both the man's feet fell off with the bandages. The hand of another man fell off at the wrist. It was a fortnight to 6 weeks since the wounds of many of the men had been looked at and dressed.
Of the 3 privates in this picture, William Young on the left was the only one wounded in combat. Henry Burland in the centre suffered frostbite in the trenches. He had his feet amputated at Scutari and his legs at Portsmouth. John Connery on the far right survived the battles of the Alma and Inkerman unscathed, but suffered 3 amputations for frostbite. Many senior officers simply went home for the winter on so-called urgent private affairs. Fanny Jubilee noted in her journal,
Lord George Paget is gone home. 38 other officers, profiting by his example, have sent in their papers.
While such fair-weather soldiers were warming themselves in their London clubs, some of the rank and file were being flogged for cowardice or shot for desertion. Paget, however, found himself snubbed in his club and returned to the Crimea in the spring. But by then, thousands of his fellow soldiers were no longer alive to greet him. Some images of the war that reached London conveyed the